You all get a gold star for supervening the security in this building and being on time, and we appreciate it. We know there will be some stragglers, but that's to be expected. I'm Jane Harmon, the president and CEO of the Wilson Center, and I have to say it's hard to sound hopeful about the subject we will address after the past week. Hundreds were gunned down last night in Las Vegas. At least I don't know. I don't think we know yet what the gunman's motives were. 2 women were stabbed to death in front of a train station in Marseille by an ISIS sympathizer. And there seems to be an unprecedented disconnect between the efforts of our Secretary of State and our President on a strategy to walk North Korea back from threats of nuclear war. Vice President Pence was here a few months ago. He's an old friend of mine from our Congress days. And he told us that the president's strategy of America first does not mean America alone. At the Wilson Center, we all hope that Vice President Pence is right. This is the 4th time Ambassador Ivo Daalder, the one and only, and the Chicago Council are here to release their survey of American public opinion. It's a great partnership between the Wilson Center and the Chicago Council, and in the parlance of this new report, we have an enduring alliance. It's also reassuring to learn the good news in this report, that Americans continue to support an active U.S. role in foreign affairs. Much of the vision for that role started with Woodrow Wilson, who was our 28th president, our only PhD president, and who was serving 100 years ago today. Downstairs in our memorial hall, you all passed by there, Wilson's words are inscribed. About his decision, and it was controversial even with him, to bring America into World War I, he said, and it really resonates now, quote, "It is a fearful thing to lead this great peaceful people into war. But the right is more precious than peace, and we shall fight for the things which we have always carried nearest to our hearts, for democracy, for the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own governments, for a universal dominion of right by such concert of free peoples as shall bring peace and a safety to all nations and make the world itself at last free." At times like this, as the audience in this auditorium and online know, the Center and the Chicago Council, we think, are needed more than ever to connect deep scholarship and thought leadership to the global challenges we face. Welcome to our panel today, moderated by the Washington Post's Karen DeYoung, and joining Karen, a friend of ours of long standing, is, of course, Ivo Daalder, and Dina Schmeltz from the Chicago Council, and Congressman Mike Gallagher, a very able newbie in the United States Congress from Wisconsin. But first, before our panel starts, a brief video.
From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first.
President Trump's inaugural address, like his campaign, signaled a major departure from the last 7 decades of American foreign policy. Slogans like "Make America Great Again" and "America First" prescribe greater protectionism in trade, a new financial reckoning with our security allies, tightening U.S. borders, and withdrawing from major international agreements. The 2017 Chicago Council survey, conducted 6 months into the Trump administration, tested the appeal of these ideas among the American public. Results show their attraction remains limited.
President Trump has repeatedly criticized allies of free riding on America's security guarantee and argued that U.S. alliances were not serving American interests. But Americans believe that maintaining existing alliances and building new alliances are among the top 3 most effective foreign policy tools. In addition, 69% of Americans say NATO is essential to U.S. security. And for the first time, majorities of Americans are willing to use U.S. troops to defend South Korea if it's invaded by North Korea, and to defend NATO allies if they're invaded by Russia.
President Trump has criticized international agreements for benefiting other countries at the direct expense of the U.S. economy and American workers. But compared to a year ago, record numbers of Americans now say that international trade is good for the U.S. economy, for U.S. consumers, and for job creation. In fact, the perceived benefits of trade are up across all political party affiliations. President Trump has also blamed poor trade deals for the loss of American jobs, and on this, a majority of Americans agree. Nearly 6 in 10 say that manufacturing job losses are due to outsourcing. Yet more Americans say that the current administration's policies will harm rather than help U.S. workers.
Immigration was a central issue during the 2016 campaign, and it remains a key pillar in Trump's America First platform. But just 37% of Americans characterize immigration as a critical threat, marking a new low in concern for this issue. There are, however, still large differences between Democrats and Republicans, with core Trump supporters the most likely of all to consider immigration a critical threat. As the perceived threat from immigration has gone down, support for illegal U.S. workers to become citizens has gone up. 65% of Americans support providing illegal immigrants a path to citizenship, an increase from 57% in 2016.
Conducted just weeks after President Trump withdrew the U.S. from the Paris Climate Agreement, the 2017 survey results show that 6 in 10 Americans continue to favor U.S. participation in the agreement. Overall, 46% of Americans now consider climate change a critical threat. While not a majority, it marks an all-time high for the measure, but it's largely a partisan issue, with 69% of Democrats declaring climate change a critical threat, compared to just 16% of Republicans.
The 2016 survey results showed that the attitudes that put Donald Trump into the White House were long-standing and could strengthen once he was in office. Yet the 2017 survey finds that instead, the ideas behind America First have not spread much beyond his core supporters. Despite the politically charged environment over the past year, Americans express remarkably enduring support for an active U.S. role in world affairs and for maintaining security alliances. In key instances, Americans have doubled down on these beliefs. Public support has risen to new highs when it comes to willingness to defend allies, the perceived benefits of trade, and a desire to grant undocumented workers a path to citizenship. And there are large differences between Republicans who strongly support President Trump and those who do not. Non-Trump Republicans are much closer to mainstream views on these issues. In the end, rather than embracing a radical reorientation of U.S. foreign policy, most Americans seem to recognize clear value in maintaining traditional security and trade relationships.
Good morning. And thank you all for being here. And thank you all. Just to summarize, as you've seen, the poll indicates that while President Trump's core supporters remain supportive of his foreign affairs positions, tighter borders, more protectionist trade, suspicion of and withdrawal from international agreements, those views have not really resonated with the majority of Americans. And in many cases, fewer Americans, even among Republicans, support those views than they did a year ago. So we found that more Americans believe that existing international alliances should be maintained, that international trade is good for the economy and consumers like you and for creating jobs. Fewer across the board see immigration as a threat. So I want to ask each of you what you think is resonating with these views. What is the reasoning behind it? Is it that more Americans are now paying attention to international issues because that conventional wisdom, as the video said, and the traditional views have been challenged, that they've learned more about those issues as Trump has addressed them and they've seen his policies play out, that in some cases maybe they see those policies as being successful, that a tight control of immigration has actually reduced the threat from immigration. So Jane, why don't you start?
Thank you, Karen. Hello again, everybody. This panel obviously is a really impressive panel, and I don't know that my view should be first, but hey. First thing, let me just raise a question, and Ivo will know the answer, but that's about the methodology of the poll. I did look at it, and I tried to figure it out, but the polling was so off, most of the polls were so off during the election. My question is, did you really adequately poll Trump's base? The reason I ask that is, even today, in the New York Times, there's a huge article about Trump's views still resonate with his base, and maybe not with others. So my first question is, what's the methodology? But I would say Americans are smart. I always used to say my constituents were the smartest, and of course they were. They made very good judgments about who to send to Congress. But a lot of people now, especially with the advent of social media, are very connected in the world, and they are their views, I think, are not necessarily shaped by what happens at a White House press conference. Their views are shaped by the people that they know and the travels that they make and the information that they read. And I think that's a good thing. I think there is a layered sense of getting information in this country. Some social media is an echo chamber on both ends, but I think that a lot of people, as I said, are smart and they're getting their information from many sources, and that's good for America, because I frankly think the views that you reveal in your poll are solid mainstream views that both parties can and should embrace.
Ivo, you want to? And maybe if you could also, you or Dina, explain how you differentiated between Republicans and core Trump supporters. That's explained far into the poll, but
yeah, we have some slides that were just up, and it actually has the full methodology. But so there are many different ways you can measure a core Trump supporter. The way we decided to define it was in a strict sense, that we looked at those people who have a very favorable opinion of Donald Trump. And that was about 26% of the overall public. And then we also looked more closely at just Republicans who had a very favorable view of Donald Trump, and found some very interesting differences between those what we call Trump Republicans versus non-Trump Republicans. So there are a lot of different ways you can look at who said they voted for Donald Trump, who didn't, but we know that most people, when they vote, they are motivated by partisan allegiances. So 9 in 10 Republicans ended up voting for Donald Trump, even though they didn't necessarily vote for him in the primaries. The same thing with Hillary Clinton and Democrats. So that's how we decided to define them. And when you look at the overall approval ratings for Donald Trump, and it's about 36, 37%. And again, not all of those people necessarily have a favorable view of him. They may just support him because of partisan allegiances. So that's the way we decided to do it, and it seemed to bear out with the data.
Go ahead.
I think one of the key findings, one of the reasons we wanted to look at the differences between what we call core Trump supporters, that is those who have a highly favorable view of the president, this being in late June, early July, and the rest is to see to the extent to which the message from the president and his foreign policy messages are resonating among his base. And the answer is they're resonating extraordinarily well. So our findings are very consistent with the idea that the president is maintaining his base in a very strong way. But then secondly, to see where is the non-base going. And the striking finding Maybe not if you are living in the Washington bubble per se, but the striking finding
Called
overall,
a swamp.
drained or undrained, as they say, is that there is the 70 to 75% of Americans who do not have a highly favorable view of Trump. That doesn't mean they have an unfavorable view, but they don't have a highly favorable view. That 70% has a pretty coherent worldview.
Yeah.
And it's a pretty, and there are differences between Democrats and Republicans and independents, but those differences are all much smaller than the differences between them and the core Trump supporters. And that's the key. The key is that America First is resonating with those who have a highly favorable view of the president, and that the traditional foreign policy, which I would describe as being pro-alliances, pro-free and fair trade, pro-international agreements that make sense for the United States, the kind of foreign policy we have conducted since 1945 has a broad, bipartisan support behind it. That's an important finding because it means that the world may not necessarily be changing as significantly, at least in the public sense, as the debate seems to indicate that we read on in our newspapers and on our Twitter feed.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, the other thing is that the views that motivate the Trump supporters, which are immigration, and what came out in our 2016 survey was that immigration and trade were where people who supported Donald Trump were really different in their views than the overall public. But this has this disaffection in terms of our immigration policy and the fear of immigrants from Republicans, and the concern for jobs being a public concern and not an elite concern. That has been there for years and decades. And so even without Trump, these supporters, these people who hold these views were still present in the population. It's just that Trump was willing to voice his concerns and tap into their grievances in a way that no other candidate had done before.
Can I dovetail off something Congresswoman Harman said, because I think it's really important. I would agree. I think while your average voter probably couldn't articulate to you why they think NAFTA is deficient, I would suspect your average member of Congress couldn't articulate that to you. They do have a sense, I think, a gut level understanding of when things aren't going well. And I do think the international environment has become sufficiently constrained to the point that, I never heard someone in the context of my campaign come up to me and say, I'm really concerned about the erosion of the norms-based, rules-based global order, right? But I did have a lot of people come up to me. I represent Northeast Wisconsin and say, in the wake of Orlando and everything we were seeing abroad, is it safe to go to a Packers game? I heard that hundreds of times. And I would submit that if our position in the world or the state of American leadership have languished to the point that it reaches Lambeau Field, then we have a problem that your average voter can understand. And I think Trump tapped into that quite effectively. But I would also agree with Ambassador Dalder that there's some good news in this survey. I mean, to the extent that we have broad bipartisan majorities, 66% of Democrats, 65% Republicans who support active American leadership, that's a great thing. And digging into the numbers on Trump supporters, only 4% of core Trump supporters actually say we should not exercise any active leadership role. That's less than the number of independents and Democrats who hold those views. 53% of core Trump supporters say that we should be the dominant world player. So far from expressing isolationism, it seems they're endorsing some version of American hegemony, which I think is it's more than like a Jacksonian reaction to being attacked. It's a sort of instinctive understanding of when we're number one, when we have a credible military deterrent, the world is safer. And to be safer and stronger, we need to support our friends and punish our enemies in simplest terms. And I think Trump tapped into that.
One of the things that surprised me about the survey is that while Americans agree that the United States should maintain strong existing alliances overseas, that was just right about half. I mean, it was not huge. And yet on individual alliances, when you were asked, should we support our allies in Asia, should we stay with NATO, those majorities were quite high, including a willingness to defend to defend allies, although I was surprised that the willingness to defend Europe against Russia was considerably lower than the willingness to defend South Korea against North Korea. People believe that the United States is the most influential country in the world. Alliances are the way to maintain that influence, and that influence should be maintained. How does that coincide with views or the policy of the administration that we should pull back from these things? How do people reconcile that in their minds, or how should they reconcile it? That pulling back will not only maintain but will increase influence, since that's what they want. Who wants to?
Let me take a stab at that, because I think it's trying. There are two things going on at the same time. I think there's a general strong support for the belief that alliances are an effective way. In fact, the 49% is a highly effective tool of American foreign policy. If you add the somewhat effective, it's in the high 70s, low 80s in terms of the view that alliances are an effective way to help America achieve its foreign policy goals. And that is reflected in strong views of alliances in Asia and Europe. At the same time, Americans generally, and again, Trump supporters more strongly than others, believe that it has been too long for the United States to bear the most of the burden of those alliances, whether it's in Europe or in Asia, and it's time for them to do more. By the way, a sentiment Americans have shared since about 1952, and has been part of American folklore and the presidential and administration level, to get allies to pay more. Not always successful. I spent 4 years banging my head on the table in Brussels trying to get them to spend more, and not always successful. The president campaigned on and has made it a very big issue that the time for allies to do more on defense is necessary. And we tested the proposition of, should the United States threaten to withhold its commitment to defend allies in order to get them to spend more, or should we use the former traditional way of persuasion and diplomacy to get the allies to pay more? And Trump supporters overwhelmingly think that we should withhold a commitment, but other supporters of other non-Trump Republicans and Democrats and independents tend to think in about 60% plus that we should use persuasion and diplomacy. And this is a valid debate we're having in our own body politic. To what extent can the United States use its power and leverage to get allies to pay more for defense? Because we all agree they need to pay more for defense as a proposition. And I think what this is showing is that maybe the tactics that the president, unconventional that may be, maybe those are the kinds of tactics that will get the kinds of results we are finally wanting to see, which is to have allies pay more for defense, but all in order to have a strong alliance.
Go ahead, you go and then.
Couple of thoughts. I also think I think Ivo's got it about right, but I think the fact that we are engaged in our longest war in history in Afghanistan, and over 3 presidencies, there has not been the ability to contain, freeze actions by North Korea to develop a nuclear capability, has affected all of us. And so people are questioning whether our traditional policies are working well enough, and no, they're not working well enough. I was just going to say something else, though, and that is about the Congress. My view is Congress fell apart when I left in 2011.
It's true.
But
It's true.
Mike Gallagher is here to resurrect it. And Congress has done some things lately, insisting on maintaining Article 5, which the president of the NATO treaty, which the president came around to too. First he didn't embrace it, then he did embrace it. Imposing sanctions where Congress thinks they could make a difference, and so forth. So it's not just President Trump and whatever he may believe, and his views have shifted some. But there is a co-equal branch of government, that I pointed out, that has people in it with long experience. I mean, Mike Gallagher doesn't look 90 years old, but he's had extensive military experience and been a national security advisor. I checked to some important people, and you know, you bring skills there, and your voices like yours are going to be very important there.
But go ahead.
I just wanted to quickly say, we actually, the reason we came into the examination of alliances and what Americans actually think about alliances is that President Trump has put forth that the way he has described them is that it's a zero sum, that you know, the United States should be getting more out of it, that the allies are taking advantage of us. And so we asked questions about who benefits the most from alliances. I'm just going to show you a quick one. So this is our alliances in Europe, and I'm just going to talk about the overall number on the far right, but we tested the idea that, okay, let's see if Americans think other countries are getting the better end of the stick for our alliances with Europe. And actually, Americans do believe by a majority that the United States and our allies benefit, 53%, or that, and 8% say that the United States mostly benefits. Now, there are differences, you can see, between the partisans, but overall, a majority do believe that, and they believe that about Asia alliances as well. So they do seem to understand that we get something, security benefit from having these partnerships abroad. For a long time now, polls have shown that Americans think NATO is essential to U.S. national security. They might not understand all of it. They might not even know about Article 5, but they have a general sense that we are safer because of it. So maybe President Trump's tweets calling NATO obsolete did raise awareness of these issues a little bit. We didn't measure that, but certainly he bandied it about a lot more in conversations than politicians usually do.
It's just, I want to move on to trade and immigration, but first I want to go back to something that Jane said about Congress pushing on the Article 5 thing, and looking more broadly at Congress's influence on these things. I mean, it must be said that there were a lot of people inside the President's National Security Cabinet who were also pushing for a confirmation of the commitment. But Mike, when you see these figures, you see how people divide up in terms of what they think. Could you, in the House in particular, could you divide especially Republicans up in just the same way? I mean, is Congress representative of the opinions reflected in this poll?
That's a great question. I would divide it differently. I think within the Republican caucus, I do think there's a divide. Well, one, there's a divide between leadership and then sort of the hoi polloi that has to sort of try and figure out what's going on. But then there's a bigger divide on these issues between the so-called fiscal hawks and the defense hawks, right? And there's a lot of people that consider themselves to be both, but don't want to do the math on where we have to make difficult trade-offs. And it's interesting, right? We're having this knockdown, drag-out debate about how much money we spend on keeping helicopters in the air versus Meals on Wheels, but you're not allowed to talk about what's actually driving up the debt, right? Because it's difficult. And if you do, you get a couple $1 million spent against you saying you want to kill everyone over the age of 67 in America. So I don't know if I divide it quite that way. I do think we need to make a division in evaluating this data between Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0 to the extent we understand what that is. But you know, Trump said a lot of things on the campaign trail, to Congresswoman Harman's point, that he's taken a different tack while in office. I don't think this administration has been friendly to Vladimir Putin, if you actually look at what they've done in any meaningful way, which I think is a good thing. That's why I was very critical of them. And to quote Kissinger, the pledges of each new administration are like leaves on a turbulent sea. So it isn't exactly a new phenomenon to see this happen. I also think there's an interesting dichotomy. And the final thing I'd say on Congress, I think it presents an opportunity for Congress to reassert, to your point, its authority. And far from being a co-equal branch of government, I believe that the founders created a legislative leviathan in Article 1, and we should be jealous about our authorities under the Constitution. But on alliances, let me just say, so there's a dichotomy among Trump supporters about being negative about alliances in general, but then far more positive than any other group about deploying military assets in defense of our allies. 18 percentage points more likely in the Middle East, 8 percentage points more in Asia. I understand the Middle East because of the overwhelming focus on ISIS. Maybe North Korea explains Asia, but it's more It's almost as if core Trump supporters support the concept of extended deterrence, right? We're not at war in Asia. We're trying to defend our allies. And so I just thought that's an interesting.
In Syria too. They're also,
yeah, exactly.
and they're also more likely to support sending troops or doing military action in Syria as well.
You know, one footnote, I was just thinking about it, and that is the diaspora in people's congressional districts. I certainly was moved by the large Croatian community, as an example, and the very large Korean community in my district. I became much more informed on some issues of relevance to them, international issues, than perhaps I was about some other issues. And when you think about gigantic amounts of European immigrants around, the Poles in Chicago, and I don't know who's in eastern Michigan, but I know the Dutch are in western Michigan, or, you know, you're not from Michigan, eastern Wisconsin, excuse me. But wherever it may be, I think that does also tend to help members of Congress get it about connections to parts of the world.
And one thing you mentioned earlier, I'm sorry to go in, but I do believe, and maybe this is a self-serving argument, that as we see more members of the 9/11 generation, veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan serve, and you're seeing more, and the Democrats, I think, are doing a very smart thing.
Including you, 2 tours in Iraq.
Back when I was useful. They're recruiting vets to run. I hope that creates a body of people on the left and the right that can work together on these issues in particular, but more broadly to maybe get past some of the intransigence we've seen in recent years.
Well, one of the things you said before, which I sort of interpreted as look at what the administration does as opposed to what Trump says. On some of these issues, clearly Trump himself has shifted, although he tends to revert back to his campaign mode when he's in front of rallies and stuff. But you know, rather than seeing Trump as obsolete, he now says we can work with NATO. NATO's great, and in fact, we see that reflected in core Trump supporters. He's moved somewhat on NAFTA, opting for renegotiation rather than withdrawal, although he recently said, but I think at the end of the day we're going to have to withdraw. So I guess my question is he bringing his core supporters along, or are they bringing him to new positions?
To me, as someone who studied the presidency for a while, I believe it's always the president, particularly on foreign policy issues, who is that kind of focal point who can unite the party. I think the Republicans haven't nominated a true isolationist since 1936. Alf Landon, Kansas. Where are my Alf Landon fans at? I know you're out there. And I do think, notwithstanding some of the unconventional statements Trump made, Republicans in general rally around sort of a hawkish criticism of the Democratic incumbent. And Gaddis has talked about this, Stanovich has talked about this, as sort of you define yourself in opposition to what the previous party has done. And that's been true. Truman criticizing Roosevelt, Eisenhower criticizing Truman, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the president, at the end of the day, is the one who has to give a logic and a coherence and some sort of strategy to that vague hawkishness. And I maybe we're seeing it emerge. I think he's appointed exceptional people. But I have no answer on the Twitter stuff. I mean, my general hypothesis is Twitter is making all of us stupid. I want to spend less time on it, but.
Yeah.
Even the Trump supporters aren't crazy about his tweeting. So.
Yeah. I want to move to trade, and Dean, if I could get you to talk a little bit about this. As we've seen, there are significant majorities overall who believe that international trade is good for the economy, it's good for consumers, it's good for jobs. But Republicans and Democrats traditionally come at this issue from totally different perspectives. So are Democrats being more supportive of international trade now as part of their opposition to Trump? Or have they fundamentally changed their mind on the issue of trade itself?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked this question. Because the trade issue is a little more nuanced than the alliances. The support for alliances is definitely bipartisan. And I think you're right that Republicans and Democrats come at trade in different ways. So right now, Americans are the most positive they've ever been in terms of our polling on the prospects of trade for being good for the U.S. economy, consumers like you, and creating jobs in the United States. But when you get to questions about globalization, you see Republicans are really just where they were, and Democrats are more positive. They seem to be growing more positive every year since 2004 on trade. There's a really big partisan divide on NAFTA. 53% overall think NAFTA is good, but there's a wide range between Republicans and Democrats on that. And I think part of that is that Republicans are feeling more positive now because it's a Republican government, there's a Republican president, and they probably expect that the trade deals will become more favorable toward the United States, or in the United States' favor. We asked the same question about alliances, about trade too, whether, again, it's a zero sum, does one country win over another? And Democrats and independents and the overall public say that it is a win-win for both sides in a trade agreement, but Republicans and especially core Trump supporters say that we're on the losing side of it. So I think that there's some hope that the current trade agreements and new trade agreements might be negotiated to put the United States in a more advantageous place.
I would point out, as a pro-trade, pro-defense Democrat, probably one of the three left on the planet Earth, that there are two wings in each party, and there have been for years. There are pro-traders in the Republican and Democratic parties and anti-traders, and that it has been always difficult, and certainly more difficult in the last 10 years, to get those wings, to put them together to get support for trade agreements, which is why we haven't seen too many. That's one point. My second point, though, is that the precipitous withdrawal, in my view, from TPP, I think sent a message way beyond trade. I think it sent a message to a lot of our friends in Asia that we might not anymore want to have the strong economic alliance with them, which was the bedrock, I think, of our last president, President Obama's so-called pivot to Asia, with stronger trading relationships with our friends. And so in foreign policy terms, as well as on the merits, I would argue that probably was ill-advised.
I think there's also a question about the people, the countries that are on the receiving end of these policies, both in terms of alliances and trade. You see, I know, in Latin America, for example, and certainly in Asia, countries that were members of TPP are going off on their own. They're making their own relationships. And so the question then becomes, when the United States, reflecting these views, is ready to make deals with them, are they going to be as ready to make deals as they have been in the past, or the same kinds of deals that we would consider advantageous? On immigration, I confess I was just totally taken aback by those figures that were across the board, with numbers that have gone up, that more and more people are in favor of a path to citizenship with immigrants. I'm not sure how that relates to the closed border question. Anybody who wants to address that? Ivo?
Well, I think, so the poll shows that there is 65% of Americans believe that there should be a path to citizenship for those who are here illegally, either very smoothly or after paying a penalty and waiting for a period of time. It's about half and half on those figures. And I think that the polarization of the immigration debate is a political polarization that may not in fact be happening in the country, which, by the way, is probably true about a lot of these issues, including trade, where the fundamental disagreement in this city isn't necessarily reflected in the rest of the country, where people are just trying to get on with their daily lives and have a basic sense of what's right and what's wrong. And particularly when we're having a debate about the Dreamers, we're finding this across the board. People want them to stay. They get it. They want to find a path towards citizenship. Second, very important issue is on the threat that immigrants represent from a security perspective to Americans. Republicans have consistently over the past few decades, about 6 in 10 believe that immigrants and refugees represent a threat to the United States. Democrats used to be there as well, and independents used to be there as well, but that has sharply decreased over time. And that's a very significant change in the way Democrats and Republicans have looked at immigration over time, so that you now have overall the lowest point in our polling of believing that immigrants and refugees pose a critical security threat to the United States. But importantly, Republicans have stayed very much the same since 2001, and Democrats are the ones that have gone down, showing the degree to which the country is split on this issue. And by the way, not too much difference between core Trump supporters and non-core Trump supporters in the Republican Party on this.
Can I just add that
Yeah.
I think the interesting thing when I look at the immigration numbers is that there is a wide disparity between Republicans who feel a real sense of alarm about this. And by the way, Republican elites do not. So it's interesting that the vocal minority of Republicans in Congress who among the public too, who are active on this issue have actually kind of overtaken that topic. But so there's a wide disparity in urgency. However, even among overall Republicans, a majority say there should be a path to citizenship, either with conditions or without.
That's
So-
for people already here.
For people
Yeah.
Yeah, for people that are already here and working here. So, and other polls have also shown, and our polls from a couple years ago show that when you package enforcement with a path to citizenship, there is bipartisan support. So as long as as long as there's something put together and has been put together in past attempts for both sides, both sets of concerns to balance each other, then there is bipartisan support.
I want to open the floor to questions. If you raise your hand, and I'll call on you. We have microphones. And if you could identify yourself and either direct your question to one panelist or to the group in general. Yes.
Thank you. Rob Litvak from the Wilson Center. To the panel, the data indicate that the strong support for the United States to support South Korea if invaded by the North, but the contingency that's being looked at now is the preventive use of force by the United States to prevent North Korean acquisition of this capability to strike the United States with a nuclear warhead on a long-range ballistic missile. What's your sense from the data about that contingency and the latitude given to a president? And since we have a current and former member of Congress on the panel, given the prerogatives of Congress on declaration of war, the contingency that's being discussed is preventive action, not preemptive action tied to an imminent threat. So what's your sense about Congress's role in all this?
Want to go first?
Sure. Well, so I would say at various points in our history, we've toyed with this idea of a massive preventive strike like that. Even Eisenhower in '53 in his famous solarium exercise briefly had a task force examine this, and then it was discarded for a variety of reasons. But I think that's a whole order of magnitude greater than some of the options that are on the table right now, like shooting down the next missile that they fire, which we probably have a 90% likelihood of being able to do. And so I think there would have to be some consultation with Congress. Maybe it's the gang of, I forget the numbers, I'm a newbie, gang of eight. Because if you open the aperture wider, the discussion would devolve into just partisan madness, but there would have to be, not just from a constitutional perspective, from a practical perspective of doing something that dramatic, you're going to need buy-in from the elected representatives of the American people to be able to sell it to the American people. Because I'm not sure what even comes close to that. What we've done before.
Yeah, comments. As a former member of the Gang of Eight, that was the chairman and ranking member of the intelligence committees and the leadership which was briefed on covert action. I don't think we're talking about that here. So I do embrace the notion that Congress should step up, because Congress reflects the American people, and have some kind of a debate about this. We had here Tim Kaine and Jeff Flake, who are co-authors of, I think, the current most credible version of an authorization to use military force in the Middle East, talk about that and what its chances of success were. They said that not great, but they're pushing. But I think that's the debate Congress has to be in. And this, you know, as Rob, who was our senior vice president here and a world expert on North Korean proliferation, obviously points out, this would be preventive, not a preventive strike. I think that's what you said. So it, you know, it has some credibility in that sense, but how we would do it and how the Koreans would understand it and what it could lead to remind 20 million South Koreans are within range of conventional weapons from the demilitarized zone in North Korea. So this is, you know, the stakes are really high, and the danger of miscalculation is huge. And if I were a current member of Congress, and the good news is you are, and I'm not, if I were a current member of Congress, I would absolutely want to be sure that I personally and my constituents understood what the ramifications of this.
When I was a staffer working on the Foreign Relations Committee, we went through this debate on the trying to re-examine the AUMF as it pertains to our lethal action against Al-Qaeda and now ISIS. And I'm of the opinion that a 17-word authorization passed 7 days after 9/11 is in need of re-examination, and we're conducting this war on very dubious legal authorities. And so in light of the way in which Congress has completely abdicated its responsibility in that domain, it's hard for me to envision a scenario in which we muster up the courage suddenly to have that debate relative to North Korea. I hope that we do very much, and I do think there are a growing number of members who recognize the importance, but it's hard to even carve out the space to have the debate.
Well, maybe we should have it here.
That's right.
Come on
Well,
down.
but there has been a debate,
Yeah.
but it hasn't brought the two sides any closer
Sure.
together. And Republicans in general and Democrats are very much divided over what a new authorization should say, and so they've never gotten to the point of you know, even having a bill.
Well, there is a bill.
No, but I mean having a bill get voted on. I mean, the committee had a couple of years ago had a sort of
Again, an
went
area
back
where I
and
think
forth
you
on
do
it, but
need
never went to the
engagement.
floor.
I didn't mean to talk over, but where you do need engagement from the president, right? To say this is what we need and this is why,
Right.
and this is our theory of victory, right? Which we never had. We didn't really have.
Didn't have with
The
Obama.
Obama administration dipped its toe into the deep end on it a little bit, but then you could tell at the end of the day they were ambivalent. After, notwithstanding what Obama said at NDU, he said a lot of good things, and then they weren't willing to do it for whatever reason.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Sharmeen Cruz, and I am here with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, EVO's entity. I'm extremely concerned about the lack of diversity in the representation of Americans, particularly leadership positions. And I understand this is something that's thrown about, you know, in sort of a lofty, soft manner. But Congresswoman Harman made a very interesting point about the immigrant communities among her constituents having informed her opinions in a manner that simply receiving policy briefings would not have. And would it not be so much better if, in fact, it were her colleagues that were American citizens that were, in fact, immigrants or Muslims or came from diverse points of view? One of the things I see over and over again as an immigrant in America is the leadership, and I do think they legitimately try to gain this perspective and this knowledge, and they read what they can, but you can't unless you know, are interacting with people who come from different parts of the world or are one of those people. What is your opinion on the significance of that and how we might concretely advance diverse representation and immigrant representation in American leadership?
So I'm an immigrant, just so people know. I was born and raised in a different country. We've had secretaries of state who have been immigrants, including two of the most brilliant ones, Secretary Albright and Secretary Kissinger. But the general point, so I still think this is a country where, frankly, the ability of immigrants to get ahead and get things done is great, and including in political life and getting elected. is higher than in almost any other country in the world. That said, I think the current climate about immigration and the way we've been talking about it has been, is deeply worrying. And I think it's one of the issues that Americans can and ought to come together on. But the degree to which representation, even in Congress, has immigrants as their representatives, whether it's original immigrants or first generation, is actually quite high. In part because we are now living in a country where the foreign-born population is at the highest level since 1910. Which is a remarkable, after the large influx in the 1890s and early part of the 20th century. So this is inevitably going to have an impact on everything we do, including on who we elect and who goes to the Foreign Service exam, who serves in our military. By the way, probably the place where immigrants are represented in larger numbers, and Congressman, you can probably speak to that as well. The military was a great force of integration of our country in the 1940s, and it continues to be a great force of integration, bringing and welcoming folks from all walks of lives to be part of that.
And I would just like to congratulate President Trump, I haven't said that many good things about him today, for appointing Nikki Haley to be our ambassador to the UN. I think it makes a difference that she has an Indian background and an immigration story to tell herself. And I think it helps U.S. credibility in the UN body.
I think there are enormous as someone who never thought they would run for office and is new to this, maybe this is going to sound naive, but if indeed you, regardless, I mean, listen, I'm a young, boring white dude, so I can't talk about this from a personal experience. But when you try and run for office, there are enormous barriers to entry, right? And unless you have the ability to raise a lot of money very quickly, if you're a younger person and are new to the political scene, it is almost impossible to do it. I mean, I got lucky in a lot of different ways that we can talk about later, but I think we do need, I just wrote an op-ed with a freshman Democrat from Silicon Valley who was a Bernie Sanders supporter. Him and I are never going to agree on the role of the federal government in healthcare, but we agree on the need for congressional reform to get at this problem where, regardless of whether you're a Mexican immigrant or whatever, it is so hard to run for office successfully. And the advantages of incumbency are still so strong that we actually have like a lower turnover rate, and by some measures, than some European monarchies. And that strikes me as a problem. And we were talking about congressional reform earlier. I mean, it's very difficult.
Except for the British monarchy.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
We only have a few more minutes, so let's take 3 questions very quickly, and then we'll try to address all of them. Way in the back there.
Hello, my name is Lauren Buetta. I'm with the Chicago Council. This is a question for Congressman Gallagher. Thank you for your service. My brother served 2 tours in Iraq, and very proud of his service. You co-sponsored the recent Border Security Act, and I noted that the act uses concepts like situational awareness, which is, I think, taken from the National Defense Authorization Act, as well as combining the biometric databases of immigrants with terrorists. What do those concepts represent about your thinking about kind of the change threat?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Let's get a couple questions, and we'll back them up, and then we'll do a sort of yes, sir, right there.
Kent Hughes here at the Wilson Center. Thank you very much for an intriguing panel and interesting results. On the trade front, it used to be that everyone saw this as being good for consumers. You can imagine the average Walmart shopper saying, hey, that's a good deal. But when you ask about jobs in the past, usually there was much greater concern. Now you see that difference really disappearing. What's the cause for that?
And I think we only have 2 more people with their hands up, so let's try to get both of them, and then we'll give brief answers.
Hi, Catherine Kauser, recent graduate of the LBJ School of Public Affairs. So this is a question for all of you. So it looks like a big implication of the numbers of the report is that the general public opinion varies fairly significantly from the executive policies of the moment. So is this going to create even more tension between Congress and the executive? Because traditionally Congress might be slightly closer to concern of the immediate public opinion?
And finally, yes, sir.
Herb Rose, Concerned Citizen. I'm concerned about methodology whenever you seek opinions. And it's become clear that more and more people are using as their source of information social media. I'm wondering whether you inquired as of as part of your methodology where people got their source of information.
Good question.
I think this ought to be part of any opinion polls that that anybody runs.
Great. Mike, you want to start? Just talk about the Border Security Act?
Sure. So when I was in uniform, I worked for the DEA for about a year doing counter-narcotics work and some on the southern border. And so I do believe the southern border is not secure, and we have to address that fact. Now, if you look at the topography, the geography of all 9 sectors of the southern border, you come away with the conclusion that there are areas where a wall makes absolutely no sense, and you have to creatively leverage technology to create that situational awareness. I just went to a drone company where they're using tethered drones that you could put on the back of a CBP truck, and for a much lower dollar figure, you could get the same thing that you want for a higher cost. And so I think we need to think creatively about that. But now I will say, I'll try and be brief, I chair this task force on denying terrorist entry in the United States. And we're looking at borders, visa waiver, all the ways in which people get into this country. But the hardest thing that I'm still trying to wrap my head around is the way in which people cross our borders every minute, every second, which is digitally, right? And this question of online radicalization is so difficult. And we haven't really been thinking creatively about how we get at that. So I don't really have a good answer for that. Hopefully what emerges from this report will take a step in the right direction.
And on trade, traditionally thought to be good for consumers, bad for jobs.
Yeah,
Has that
this
changed?
is actually the first time that we have found a majority think trade is going to be good for creating jobs. So on the Republican side, we think this is more of a measure of hope that trade agreements and trade now under a new administration and will end up being more advantageous for Americans. I mean, President Trump made jobs and creating jobs and bringing back jobs a really big centerpiece of his platform. So for Republicans, I think it's hope that he will be able to do that. For Democrats, we're reading this as a rejection of the anti-trade messages that came from both parties in the last, during the primary and presidential campaign period.
Yeah, I would just say that on trade, I think both parties missed the trade movie, which is that there was increasing anxiety of people in the middle of the country about displacement. They thought it was due to trade. It's much more due to technology than it is to trade. And if you're, again, it depends where you live and who you represent. If you're in the border states, the southern border, but more the northern border with Canada, you understand that cross-border manufacturing is a huge part of your economic engine, especially cars, which go back and forth across the border, so I'm told 16 times before you actually make a car. And I think people are more sophisticated. I started with this. I think people are much smarter than they're sometimes given credit for being. And so I think that has changed. I think your question about the sources of news is a really good question, and I don't know whether that was probed by the Chicago Council or not, perfect as it is.
Go ahead.
Here it is.
Yeah, so only 12% get their news from social media, 9% from blogs. Most people still get their news from network TV, 34%, and cable TV, 28%. 8% newspapers, 7% radio. And the only really big differences among the groups are that Trump Republicans are more likely to get their news from cable TV, while other Republicans who do not have a very favorable view of Trump are more likely to get it from network TV. But yeah, it's still TV mostly.
And finally, a question that we sort of dealt with a little bit before, as you see public opinion moving away from the administration on some issues, what problems does that pose for Congress in terms of representing people rather than the party in power in the White House.
Yeah, so I just worry a little bit. First of all, I think this report is incredibly valuable, and I'm honored to be part of this. But we are at risk of sort of missing the forest for the trees, right? Because to some extent, because the data, if they are as you say they are, it poses a big question, which is why did Trump win, right? Why did he beat 16 other candidates? If he's outside the mainstream, right? Why did he beat a much better funded Democratic opponent? And I think the answer is that his message was more powerful than the sum of these individual parts, right? To some extent, it wasn't about NAFTA. It wasn't about moving away from alliances. It was about sort of a rejection of the elites, right? And embracing the forgotten man, right? I think that's true on some level. He tapped into that.
And partisan loyalties.
Yeah. And even on immigration, it's fascinating. It's like, so Trump, the report was that he struck this deal with Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, which you think would get the base against him. But the message I heard was that, well, he was forced to do that because McConnell, right? You guys can't get your act together. So to the extent I worry about something or a civil war in the Republican Party, if we don't deliver on some of this stuff, that's going to get worse.
Go ahead. You can have the final word.
Just on this point, because I do think I think you're right on these data they don't explain, and they can't explain electoral outcomes, which are binary choices, and therefore all kinds of things fall into it. What this demonstrates is that if you want to have a foreign policy that fits more within the general stream of how bipartisan administrations for the last 70 years have conducted foreign policy, the public will enable you to do that. The fundamental question, which this report doesn't answer, is how do you talk to that public in a way that is convincing enough to mobilize them in support of trade, of alliances, of sensible kinds of foreign policy? And that's the translation of ideas into politics and into action. What this suggests is America's not retreating. America's not isolationist. Americans don't want to come home America. This is not 1972. It's a very different kind of America. So you are enabled to have a foreign policy that is much more within the mainstream. Doesn't guarantee we will have one. It says that there is an opportunity to build on that.
Thank you, and thank all of you. If you haven't picked up a copy of the poll and the report, I would recommend that you do so. It's got all kinds of fascinating things in it that we didn't have time to touch on, but I commend it to you. There's also a story about it in the Washington Post this morning, which I will commend to everyone. And thank you all very much, and thank you to the panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.